Okay, so today we're gonna learn how to make gouache paint. It's really similar to making watercolors. You just add a couple extra ingredients. And so here you wanna get all your things set up. And so you're gonna need a palette knife, a nice clean, preferably glass palette, a dropper, you have to have your gloves on, a safety mask, and your pigment, some champagne chalk, Kremer watercolor medium is what we're using. You can make this yourself, but we're just using a pre-made one, and a container to put your paint in. And then afterwards you want to test your paint to make sure that you have the right proportions of things. And so first, before opening the container of pigment or handling any pigment, you want to make sure your gloves are on and that your safety mask is on. Okay, so you scoop the pigment just a little bit into a neat pile. You could also just use your palette knife to do it. A little bit makes a good amount, so you don't want to put like mounds of it on. You'll kind of just make a mess. You keep it in a nice neat pile. A little more. That should be enough for like a decent amount. Gouache, when you make it, it's like watercolor. A lot goes along, or a little bit goes a long way, so that'll be fine. So when you, let's get this out of the way. When you make it, you want to make a little well. And first you're gonna put the watercolor medium. So basically we're making watercolor first. And then what makes it gouache is adding in the chalk. It gives it a matte finish. So you make the well for your oil type of medium. And you use the dropper because you just want to do a couple drops at a time. And the amount of drops that it takes depends on each pigment, but you basically just put enough until you get like a toothpaste sort of consistency. You just mix like a tiny bit at a time, and it can take a little bit. You don't want it to get chunky at all, just a lot of patience. Okay, so now that we have a nice paste-like, toothpaste-like consistency, we want to add a little bit of the chalk, which it says typically to do 1 part chalk, 6 part the pigment suspension. And so you don't want to put too much chalk. You kind of like eyeball it. And the more chalk you put, the lighter this will get because it can affect the coloration for some. It depends how strong the pigment is and how easily influenced it is. But you kind of want to do the same thing we did with the watercolor medium, is just add a little bit at a time. Because if you just start mixing it all up, it's going to get really chunky, really messy all over your palette. And it's just, you're gonna spend more time mixing it than you should. So you can kind of see the yellow getting a bit lighter because of the chalk. After you add the chalk, it'll be a little bit more gritty. So you kind of just want to mull it out so that it really, you really press together the particles. Kind of want to mull it in like figure eights or small circles, just to really make sure everything's pressed and mixed together really nicely. And scoop it up, make sure that it doesn't get everywhere. Alright, and so now that you have this, you have to test it to see if you put enough oil and chalk, enough medium and chalk. If you didn't, then there won't be enough things binding the pigment. And so basically you have a piece of test paper and you take just basically a little swab and make a little mark with your brush, and you let it dry. And then once it's dry, you wipe it with your finger, and if pigment gets on your finger, that means there's not enough in the paint that's binding the pigment, so the particles are still kind of loose. And then if that happens, then you have to go back, add a little bit more watercolor medium, then a little bit more chalk. And so I'm just wetting my brush a little bit. I have off to the side a water dish. And so with a little bit of water, I get some. I'm just gonna make a mark. Then I gotta let that dry, and I'll test it, do the finger test. So now that it's dried, I'm gonna wipe my finger lightly over it and see. You can see there's some yellow smudged on, so that means we need to add a little more of the medium to help bind it, and a little more chalk, because there's still loose pigment in there. A tiny bit more chalk. And we're going to mix it in the same way we did before. Make sure to not go too overboard, because you don't want this to be gooey and liquidy. You still want to keep that sort of paste. So we're just going to add a tiny bit more. Alright. Okay, so we're going to do another sample. Make sure to clean your brush. You don't want any of the old sort of paint on it. Just this new paint. A slightly wet brush, you just take another thing and make another sample. Could be a little more paint on there. And you just let that dry for a bit. Okay, so now that this is dry, you're going to use a clean finger. You don't want to use your old dirty finger, because then you won't be able to tell. So we're going to use a clean finger and just rub, rub, rub gently. And then this one, it didn't come off. And so that means that you have a good balance of the oil and the chalk. And so now you have your gouache paint, and you can store it just like watercolor, where you just put it straight on your palette. It can dry out, and then when you go to paint with it, you rehydrate it with some water. I have just a container here to put it in. You could also put it in tubes of used for tubing paint, so that you keep it wet like this, because it's nice. I like painting personally with more of a creamy gouache rather than having it dry out, because adding water does lose some opacity. But then you just put it in your container. Get as much of it as possible. Every bit counts. And then there you go. There's your little bit of gouache paint, and that'll last you like a decent amount of time. That's good. That's good. now you know. There you go.